Ferrari's completely revamped 2024 F1 car has broken cover, and there's one area it stayed the same that leaves Ferrari as a risky outlier compared to its main rivals. The new Ferrari SF-24 is described by technical director Enrico Cardile as a big departure from its first two cars of the ground effect era that started in 2022. And Ferrari's putting a huge emphasis on its aerodynamic work, turning it into a title contender, prioritising that over a new suspension direction that would bring it in line with rivals, which we'll explain shortly. Cardile says the SF-24's main targets are better drivability and a robust platform, so it actually does what the wind tunnel predicts, and is better in the race without sacrificing qualifying performance. That's a reference to Ferrari getting a nasty surprise when the SF-23 ran on track last year in testing. The team realised it didn't quite correlate, and the car proved to be difficult to drive in certain conditions. This undermined Ferrari's ambitions of competing with Red Bull more consistently. It didn't win as many races as in 2022, scored nowhere near as many points, and fell to third in the Constructors' Championship. By mid-season, we knew Ferrari was planning a very different 2024 car. A new chassis, a new gearbox and rear end, and some significant aerodynamic design changes add up to what team boss Fred Vasseur has called a car with 95% new components. If everything works, this will be the basis for Ferrari's 2025 car too, so it can focus more on the brand new 2026 rules from January next year. But let's stick with the 2024 car for now, starting with the area that hasn't changed dramatically and why that stands out. Red Bull technical chief Adrian Newey said from the start of the new rules in 2022 that optimising these low, stiff ground effect cars is all about getting the underfloor and suspension to work in tandem. Belatedly, other engineering chiefs have arrived at the same conclusion. So a major focus for Red Bull's main rivals across 2023 and now 2024 has been on suspension and platform control, with anti-dive and anti-squat features to keep the car more balanced and more consistent aerodynamically when exposed to the most extreme forces under braking, acceleration and high speed. There is a clear convergence on a push-rod rear suspension configuration, which provides better aerodynamic opportunities as it moves a key element out of the way for cleaner airflow to the diffuser and rear wing area, and it gives the opportunity for a slightly smaller gearbox as it can be packaged more neatly. But Ferrari is refusing to go in that direction. Its SF-24 stays with pushrod at the front and pull rod at the rear, making Ferrari the only team consciously choosing the pull rod rear configuration, with its customer Haas having to follow suit because it takes that part from Ferrari. The Red Bull teams, McLaren, Alpine and even Ferrari customer Sauber were already using pushrod rear suspension. Mercedes has now made that switch as well, based on what we saw from the new Aston Martin, which uses the Mercedes rear end, and unless Williams does something surprisingly dramatic, it should have the same. Sauber is a particularly interesting case as it went to extremes in 2022 to have a pushrod design. While Ferrari supplies the gearbox internals, Sauber developed its own casing in order to be able to have its own suspension geometry design, complete with pushrod. That remains in place to this day, as Sauber technical director James Key says while it's a coin toss whether you go pull or pushrod at the front, there's a clear advantage to pushrod at the rear. Cardile says Ferrari investigated a pushrod layout but didn't measure a big enough advantage to justify the compromises it thought there would be in terms of weight and compliance. Instead, Ferrari is happy with how it has balanced those factors against aerodynamic performance with its existing layout and doesn't plan on changing that this year. The suspension comes down to not just the fundamental configuration, but the geometries too. Ferrari has added more anti-dive in the front and there's more anti-squat in the rear, but Cardile admits that the front suspension is mostly a carryover from 2023. The rear has had more work done, likely in association with a shorter gearbox and slightly longer chassis. Cardile says the inboard suspension is now located differently inside the gearbox, which constitutes a different concept and an innovation, he says, compared to the previous design. The forward leg of the upper wishbone is mounted lower inboard than before, and the pull rod inboard mounting seems to have been relocated further rearward, closer to the lower rear wishbones. Clearly the suspension has been adjusted and optimised, but Cardile has something of a contrasting view to his peers. We got an idea of this last year in an end of season interview in which he said suspension setup is a bit overrated. His argument is that aerodynamics dictate things more, from setup options to tyre wear, and he suggested that the suspension can play a role only if it's bad. Ferrari clearly believes it is on top of its mechanical platform, so can prioritise aerodynamics, but it does also sound like Cardile has a fundamental difference of opinion about the relative importance of suspension in this generation of car, and Ferrari is undeniably out on its own compared to its rivals. So is it right, and the configuration doesn't matter as long as it all works, or has Ferrari baked in a fundamental performance limitation? While the Ferrari SF-24 is described as a mostly new car, it's the full realisation of a direction it started to head in aerodynamically last year. At June's Spanish Grand Prix, it introduced an upgrade package including side pod tweaks that took a step back from its old concept and towards this new one. The changes at the rear of the side pods introduced a downwash effect, effectively cutting into the scalloped side pod surface design Ferrari had used since the start of these regulations in 2022. One of the priorities of this new direction was to generate more consistent aerodynamic performance, improving rear end stability and also the way the car used its tyres. The new car is effectively a fresh start building on that initial work. So let's take a look at the detail. There's an obvious change at the front with a modified nose that has been reshaped and made slightly flatter and wider. This should improve the way the airflow is shed off the sides of the nose, which is an important part of influencing the airflow lowdown that will eventually feed the all-important underfloor. The side pods are the most clear area of change. The new inlet is still nowhere near as much of a top surface opening as what Red Bull had last year or what Aston Martin has this year, with a bigger opening that suggests it needs to help the engine cool more. The downwash ramp introduced last year has become significantly more aggressive, and there is a more pronounced undercut at the front of the side pod. To achieve this, the lower side impact structure is now incorporated lower and into the floor. Combined with the reprofiling of the end fence, this should work the front corner of the floor harder and accelerate the airflow around the side pod. It is unmistakably in the direction of the trend set by Red Bull. The floor doesn't look dramatically different to last year's, but that's often the case with launch cars, so watch this space. Higher up, there's a big change where the halo meets the chassis at the rear. The halo itself is a set shape and made of titanium, so this is all about the aerodynamic packaging. The halo is encased in an aero fairing, and to this Ferrari has attached a piece of bodywork that connects to the front of a small duct that's formed on the shoulder of the front of the side pod. This should control the airflow in that area, but could just be the exit duct for some cooling in the lower part of the chassis. Either way, it should be more effective than the smaller duct it had last year. The change to the architecture of the car, making the chassis 5cm longer, offset by the gearbox being 5cm shorter, should mean greater freedom aerodynamically around the diffuser. Given a weakness of the car last year was aerodynamic stalling at the rear, hence the back end instability, this is potentially one of the ways this is being tackled. Based on the work in the simulator, Charles Leclerc reckons Ferrari has definitely made a step forward and the car is reacting extremely well. But after last year's experience, he's cautioned that he needs to see this correlate on track in testing. Though the headline numbers from 2023 were worse than 2022, Fred Vasseur's Ferrari is on a better trajectory than before. The 2023 car was conceived prior to his arrival as team principal in January last year, and he inherited a team that seemed to lack confidence and competence operationally and technically. At the start of the year, Ferrari was simply slower than expected, its car was not well balanced, it made mistakes, had communication problems, and there were some reliability issues too, which has led to some engine elements being modified for this year. Vasseur joked at the end of 2023, "Everybody told me you will see at Ferrari you will start the season very well and then it's going down. Trust me, after Jeddah or Melbourne, I said, what the f***, if this was the good part of the season, we will be in big trouble." One season alone isn't enough to transform a team, but Vasseur did invoke change through the year, and the Ferrari he started to shape became a much better proposition. Ferrari scored 15.9 points per event in the first 12 weekends of the year up to the summer break, but across the last 10 events, that rose to 21.5 points per event. It's been a long time since we've observed that trend from Ferrari. In fact, 2023 was the first normal season since 2012 that Ferrari scored more points per race after the summer break than before it. The number of poles and podiums also rose, and Ferrari even managed to win a race in the second half of the year, the only non-Red Bull team to do so. Vasseur's a quiet leader, and Ferrari started to reflect his image more through the season, more calm and more robust. Early season personnel changes across the technical, strategic and race operation teams seemed to pay dividends, as Ferrari looked a lot more convincing in terms of making the most of what it had, and did a better job with car development too. Vasseur's Ferrari also looks to be a healthier balance between empowering the workforce and eliminating mistakes, fostering the kind of culture that his predecessor Mattia Binotto talked about a lot but struggled to actually implement. Vasseur's still demanding more efficiency though, and 2024 will be a big test of the theory that his Ferrari started to become more effective. This is all a good foundation for 2025 and beyond, a period we will soon be looking ahead to as Ferrari's Lewis Hamilton era. And for the avoidance of doubt, that's not to disparage Charles Leclerc in any way, it's just shorthand for the period in which Hamilton drives for Ferrari. While Ferrari unsurprisingly tried to avoid talking too much about Hamilton's impending switch from Mercedes for 2025 around the launch of the SF-24, his arrival will be the elephant in the room for pretty much any Ferrari topic this year. Everything that happens in what is effectively year zero for the Hamilton-Ferrari era will significantly shape what Hamilton encounters in 2025 and thereafter. The ramp-up's already begun at Ferrari, it doesn't start when Hamilton gets there. So this season will indicate things like how Ferrari wants to build Hamilton's side of the garage, but Hamilton's also part of a broader ongoing project. Fred's Ferrari is still being moulded, with high-profile recruits from Mercedes and Red Bull coveted if not already secured. For example, Loic Serra, Mercedes performance director, and Red Bull technical director Pierre Vacher have been linked with Ferrari for some time. Such big hires and any kind of extensive recruitment would take time to make an impact. Even the new rules in 2026 might come too soon to benefit instantly from some individuals, but by then Ferrari will hope to have enough of its big guns firing to launch a championship assault. Given 2025 will likely be considered part of the ramp up, especially as Hamilton assimilates, 2026 has to be the big target. That process starts now by validating technical directions, further sharpening operations, integrating the recruits Vasseur is already phasing in, and chasing whoever else they want, whether that's specifically for Hamilton or to further strengthen the team's technical depths. Whichever way you look, this season has to be a stepping stone to the high potential future that Ferrari's setting up.